Hey guys, welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today's video is an update of a video I did back in November. If you recall, I checked out if Nvidia's new GeForce GTX 1050 Ti graphics card had the measure of 2012's flagship GTX 680. Weeks prior to creating that video, I was benchmarking with the new Titanfall 2 game, and I noticed while benchmarking that the 1050 Ti was actually able to match the performance of the GTX 680 in that title. So out of interest, I looked a bit further into some other games to see how the two compared, and I found that actually overall the 1050 Ti was slightly faster, and this is despite featuring 33% fewer CUDA cores. The 1050 Ti is of course based on a much more refined architecture. Pascal is considerably more efficient than Kepler. So the 1050 Ti might have fewer cores, but the cores it does have are able to get more done, and they're also clocked higher for good measure. Anyway, in that video, heaps of you asked me to retest with the Radeon HD 7970 included. Well, actually, okay, so from the 500 plus comments, like 2 of you asked for a retest, but whatever, I thought it was a good idea, so here we are. Complementing the games tested previously, I've thrown in some oldies as well. The Tomb Raider reboot along with Sleeping Dogs has been added. This takes the total games tested to 8. All 3 graphics cards have been tested on our Core i7 6700K test rig using the latest available drivers. So then, on to the benchmarks. First up we have F1 2016, and this was one of the games tested previously where the 1050 Ti was a good bit faster than the GTX 680. Here you can see the newer budget GPU is 12% faster when comparing the average frame rate. Although the minimum frame rate for the 7970 was slightly lower than the 680, it pulled ahead for the average. This meant the 1050 Ti was just 4% faster than the 7970 when comparing the average frame rate. That said, I should note that it was also 23% faster when comparing the minimum frame rate. The 1050 Ti is able to slightly improve upon the GTX 680 in Mirror's Edge Catalyst. However, when compared to the 7970, it was 10% slower, and we see here that AMD's flagship GPU from 2012 runs away with it, rendering 73 FPS on average. For those of you keeping score at home, this meant the 7970 was 14% faster than the 680. Generally speaking, Overwatch plays slightly better on Nvidia hardware, and here we're seeing that. Still, with the ultra quality preset in place, the 7970 churned out an average of 100 FPS. This meant the 680 was 11% faster, while the 1050 Ti enjoyed a 13% performance advantage. What about 2016's most epic title, Battlefield 1? Well, here the 7970 was good for 50 FPS, on average making it 6% slower than the 680. When compared to the 1050 Ti, the 7970 was 14% slower, though it was just 4% slower when comparing the minimum frame rate. This is another title developed closely with Nvidia, so it's not entirely surprising that 680 comes out ahead of the 7970 here. That said, the margins were extremely slim. The 680 was just 5% faster when comparing the average frame rate. The 1050 Ti, on the other hand, was 18% faster. You can probably thank driver optimization for that. The GTX 680 and 1050 Ti provided very similar performance when testing with Titanfall 2, both averaged 62 FPS. This made them 6% slower than the 7970, which averaged 66 FPS. That is a solid result for AMD's almost 5-year-old graphics card. Like the GTX 680 and HD 7970, Sleeping Dogs was released back in 2012. Comparing the 3 GPUs in this game shows fairly similar performance across the board. The GTX 680 was 4% faster than the 7970 for the average result, but 7% slower for the minimum. Meanwhile, the 1050 Ti delivered a strong average result with a weaker than expected minimum. This isn't this year's Rise of the Tomb Raider, but rather 2013's reboot. With TressFX enabled, you could argue that AMD has an advantage here, but we also test The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt with Hairworks enabled for the most part, so you'll just have to deal with it, even if things do get a bit hairy. Anyway, the 7970 was just a single frame faster on average than the 1050 Ti, though it was 3 FPS faster when comparing the minimum frame rate. Finally, we have the total system power consumption figures, and this is where the real gains have been made. The Core i7 test system consumed 116 watts with the 1050 Ti handling the rendering work. That's almost half the power consumption of the 680, while it's less than half of that of the 7970. Looking back, it doesn't seem like the GTX 680 or the 1050 Ti got trashed by the 7970 like many viewers suggested it would have in the previous comparison video. In fact, once we tally up the numbers, we find some very interesting results. I'm sure some of you won't believe me, but on average the 680 and 7970 delivered the exact same performance in the 8 games tested. They both came out with an average of 71 FPS, while the 1050 Ti nudged ahead with 74 FPS. So what about the minimums though? Well, again, there wasn't much in it. The 1050 Ti and 7970 both averaged 56 FPS, while the 680 was just 1 FPS slower. Honestly, these results aren't at all surprising. Earlier this year we created a video that compared the 680 and 7970 in 9 new games as well as 9 old games. AMD and Nvidia traded blows in both the new and old titles to deliver similar performance overall. Finally, I would just like to point out that I'm not trying to paint the GTX 1050 Ti as an amazing graphics card with this video. It's simply a look at where we are now and what we've come from. The GTX 1050 Ti isn't the best value sub $200 GPU. We've already awarded that honour to the RX 470 or the R9 290 if you're willing to go second hand and take a big hit on power consumption. The reason we use the 1050 Ti as the test subject is simple. It's the most recently released GPU, making it a bit more of a hot topic. Personally, I really enjoy these new and old comparisons, and I know a lot of you guys do as well. So be sure to let me know what you thought of the results in the comments below, and if you have any ideas for comparisons I could make in the future, be sure to let me know those as well. Anyway, that's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll catch you next time.